Welcome to today's Explainer. We're traveling straight to the heart of the Himalayas for this one, where a seriously fascinating story has been unfolding. For years, young Nepalis just had to watch as politicians made promise after promise, while out in the real world, unemployment and frustration just kept growing. It felt like their voices were literally being ignored. But in 2025, a whole generation of digital natives finally said, okay, enough is enough. They decided it was time to actually demand change.
Which brings us to a huge question. What actually happens when a digitally native generation is pushed right to the edge? Today, we're going to unpack the incredible story of how simmering online frustration transformed into one of the absolute most powerful youth movements in Nepal's modern history. We'll see how a generation born with smartphones in their hands completely shook up the political landscape, totally bypassing traditional systems to make sure their voices were heard.
Section 1. The Breaking Point. So to really grasp what went down, we've got to look at the kindling that started the fire, right? I'm talking about the deep-seated economic and political frustrations that Nepali youth were dealing with way before anyone actually marched. You've got thousands of educated young people really struggling to find jobs. And because of that, so many were essentially forced to migrate, leaving the country just to find work, which left their families relying heavily on foreign remittances just to survive. And while all this is happening, the youth are looking at their political leaders and seeing them as totally disconnected from everyday reality. Accusations of corruption, favoritism, and misusing public resources, that became the absolute norm in daily conversation.
And that leads us to this specific, super crucial term that really blew up online, Nepo kids. Young Nepalese popularized this phrase to call out the unchecked privilege and massive political influence enjoyed by a few powerful families. So the key takeaway here is that this wasn't just about needing jobs. It was about basic fairness. The youth wanted a system built on actual merit and hard work, not just who your parents are or who you're connected to.
Section 2. The Digital Spark.
So what actually set this off? What was the spark? Well, even before 2025, the internet was this massive space where the younger generation was finding its voice and calling out alleged abuses of power online. But then, in September of 2025, the government drops a bombshell and announces restrictions on several major social media platforms. Now, officials claim the platforms weren't complying with regulations, but for the youth, this was seen as a direct attack on their freedom of expression. Within minutes, anger just spread like wildfire across Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And in a matter of days, all that digital criticism morphed into massive, nationwide, real-world demonstrations.
Section 3. Taking to the streets.
At this point, the movement totally spills out from screens and keyboards and right into physical locations, especially the capital city, Kathmandu. And the crowd was incredibly diverse. We're talking students, workers, artists, content creators, young professionals. Everybody was there. A lot of them were carrying the Nepali flag. And for a huge chunk of the crowd, this was literally their very first time ever joining a political demonstration. That highlights something huge. This wasn't some highly organized rally by a traditional political party. It was a completely organic gathering of ordinary citizens, all united by this shared demand for transparency, accountability, and real reform.
And this perfectly illustrates why this movement was so unprecedented. Look at the contrast. Traditional political movements usually have this centralized leadership, right? A single leader calling the shots from the top down. But the Gen Z movement? Exact opposite. Totally leaderless. It thrived entirely on grassroots energy from everyday citizens, and the whole thing was coordinated using digital networks, social media, and messaging apps. They just completely threw out the traditional playbook.
Section 4. Escalation and response.
Now, as these crowds swelled in size, things definitely entered a much more intense phase. And unfortunately, the peaceful demonstrations escalated into a major crisis. On one side of the street, you had the demonstrators whose numbers were just growing and growing, attempting to move closer to key government buildings. On the other side, security forces responded by rolling out heavy crowd control measures. We're talking tear gas and water cannons. Clashes broke out, and the situation on the ground quickly became highly dangerous.
But remember who we're talking about here. This is a digitally native generation. So, the internet acted as this massive megaphone. Real-time uploads, images, and videos of these dangerous clashes were being broadcast to the whole world instantly. And that real-time documentation pulled in major international news organizations who immediately started reporting on the unrest in Nepal. So what started as local frustration instantly compounded into an immense, highly visible political crisis, putting an enormous amount of pressure on the government.
Section 5. A divided nation.
Under all that mounting pressure, the government did eventually lift the social media restrictions. But by then, the movement had grown way beyond that one single issue. It had sparked this really deep, divided national debate. On one hand, supporters saw the Gen Z movement as this historic, totally necessary fight against corruption and political stagnation. To them, it was a demand for a merit-based society and a real fight for dignity. But on the other hand, critics were quick to point out that the protests had become way too chaotic. Because there was no clear leadership at the top, critics argued the movement was just causing dangerous instability, property destruction, and violence. Basically, the entire nation was split right down the middle on both the methods and the actual impact of the demonstrations.
Section 6. The Gen Z Legacy. When we zoom out and look at the lasting structural impact of this whole event, it really gives us the blueprint for modern civic action. It's like the anatomy of a modern protest. Step 1. A single video is recorded on a smartphone. Step 2. It reaches thousands of people online in a matter of minutes. Step 3. A simple hashtag inspires highly coordinated, real-world action across entirely different cities. It proves that digital spaces and real-world activism are now permanently tied together. A massive national event can literally start with just one single post.
There's this really powerful quote that sums it up perfectly. The youth of Nepal demonstrated that they are not passive observers. They are active participants in shaping their country's future. And, while it's totally true that lasting structural change takes years of hard work and accountability, this digitally connected generation proved something undeniably vital. They proved that they demand to be heard, and for sure, they've got the tools to make sure they cannot be ignored.
So I want to leave you with a thought to really ponder today. When you look back at the Nepal Gen Z movement of 2025, what exactly did we just witness? Was this a full-blown revolution? Was it just a massive, incredibly loud warning to politicians? Or are we looking at the absolute beginning of a completely new political era? The answer to that is going to shape the Himalayas for decades to come. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.